Let's talk about the kind of person who is so emotionally intelligent, so self-aware, and so strong in their own values that they completely shift the dynamic with someone who once confused them. I'm talking about the super empath, the person who used to feel powerless around avoidance, but now holds the power of clarity and boundaries. Now, we've all been there. You meet someone who seems interested at first, maybe even a little obsessed. They send good morning texts, compliment you, plan the next date. And then just when you start getting comfortable, they start pulling away. They become distant. You're left asking yourself, did I say something wrong? Did I move too fast? The avoidance pattern is almost textbook. Intimacy rises. They panic. Their nervous system screams, danger, closeness, and they retreat. What makes it worse? They often blame you for needing too much, even though your needs are perfectly reasonable. But here's where the super empath turns the game around. You see, the super empath doesn't just feel deeply, they think deeply. They've done the inner work. They've learned that just because someone avoids intimacy doesn't mean it's their job to chase fix or prove their worth. Instead, they recognize emotional unavailability for what it is, a red flag wrapped in temporary charm. They stop trying to decode mixed signals. They stop playing therapist to someone who's terrified of connection. They no longer feel the need to earn love by shrinking themselves. The super empath reclaims their energy not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And guess what happens when that shift occurs? The avoidant notices. They notice that you're not reacting like you used to. You're not anxiously waiting for a text. You're not over-explaining yourself. You're not walking on eggshells. You're calm, clear, centered. And that scares them, not because you're doing anything to them, but because you're finally doing something for yourself. They realize they're no longer in control of the emotional narrative. The super empath has flipped the script, not by playing games, but by playing by truth. They express their needs, hold their boundaries, and walk away when those boundaries are not honored. They no longer fear losing someone who doesn't show up. Instead, they fear losing themselves in a relationship that doesn't meet their emotional standards. That's real power. And here's the ultimate twist. The avoidant may come back, feeling drawn to the strength they once mistook for neediness. But by then, the super empath sees clearly. And whether they let that person back in or not, it's on their terms. They don't seek revenge. They don't need closure. They've already won. Because nothing is more powerful than being someone who knows their worth and acts like it. When someone has spent most of their emotional life overgiving, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that love must always be earned. The super empath has been there. They've been the person who stayed a little too long, gave a little too much, and waited a little too patiently for someone who was emotionally absent. But then something shifts, and that shift is everything. They stop chasing. They start choosing. This is not a sudden decision born out of bitterness. It's the result of slow, painful lessons learned through emotional exhaustion and deep self-reflection. The super empath begins to see that chasing someone who's running from connection only leads to emotional burnout. They realize that love should feel like a mutual effort, not a pursuit. They become acutely aware of how much of their energy has been spent trying to prove their worth to people who couldn't even meet them halfway. In that awareness, they discover a radical truth. The problem was never that they felt too much. The problem was thinking that their feelings needed someone else's permission to exist. Choosing rather than chasing means evaluating someone's behavior against your values instead of just reacting to your feelings. The super empath starts asking themselves better questions. Is this person capable of meeting my emotional needs? Replaces, why are they pulling away? That subtle but powerful shift puts them back in control of their emotional life. They no longer measure a connection by how strong their feelings are, but by how consistent the other person is. They begin to filter people through the lens of alignment, not intensity. This new way of relating isn't cold or distant. It's grounded. It's centered in emotional intelligence. The super empath can still feel everything, but now their feelings are balanced by self-respect. They still want love, but they don't want it at the cost of losing themselves. So when an avoidant person enters their life and begins that familiar cycle of hot and cold, the super empath doesn't interpret it as a challenge to win. They see it as a pattern they've outgrown. They're not afraid to walk away, not because they don't care, but because they care about themselves more. They know that if someone is uncertain about them, they don't need to stay and convince them. Their peace is not up for negotiation. And what's remarkable is that this energy is felt by the avoidant person, even if they can't articulate it. The dynamic changes instantly, where the avoidant once had control, retreating and returning whenever they pleased. They now sense a steady boundary that doesn't flinch at inconsistency. The super empath doesn't beg for clarity. They are clarity. They've realized that their love is valuable, not because of what it might one day become, but because of what it already is. They no longer give endlessly without reciprocity. Instead, they observe, they listen. They see whether someone shows up consistently, emotionally, and authentically. And if not, they move on without the drama, without the performance, and without the need to be validated by someone who's still running from their own heart. This kind of power doesn't look loud. It's quiet, steady, and unshakable. It comes from making 100 small choices that all say the same thing: I choose me. And in choosing themselves, the super empath reclaims everything they once gave away for free. Their time, their emotional energy, their peace of mind. They're no longer just someone who feels deeply. They're someone who leads with that depth, but knows exactly when to pull back. That's how they stop chasing. That's how they start choosing. And that's how they change the entire dynamic. The moment a super empath stops attaching their worth to someone else's response, they begin to truly take their power back. For a long time, they may have internalized the avoidant silence, inconsistency, or withdrawal as something they caused. When the avoidant pulled away, they blamed themselves. When messages went unanswered or plans became vague, they wondered what they did wrong. But the truth is, much of what avoidants do has little to do with the person they're dating and everything to do with their own unresolved fear of intimacy. The super empath begins to see this not just logically but emotionally. They stop taking the behavior personally, and in doing so, they remove the avoidant's power over their emotional state. With awareness comes detachment. Not the cold, emotionless kind, but the kind rooted in clarity. They start to observe the emotional dance with curiosity instead of desperation. They stop reacting to every shift in the avoidance mood or behavior. They stop making excuses for why the connection feels unstable. Instead of being pulled into the anxious spiral of trying to fix things, they pause, reflect, and name what's really happening. They realize, this isn't about me being too much. This is about them being unable to handle closeness. When an avoidant creates distance, the super empath no longer chases. They allow space, but not in the hopes of winning the person back. They allow space to protect their own peace. They know that if someone truly values the connection, they will return with emotional clarity, not ambiguity. And if they don't return, that's its own kind of answer. This is a level of maturity and self-respect that doesn't come overnight. It's earned through pain, through repeated patterns, and through finally getting tired of losing themselves in relationships where they were never truly seen. The detachment the super empath practices is not a game or a manipulation tactic. It's a self-preserving choice. They recognize that attachment without awareness leads to codependency. But awareness transforms attachment into discernment. They can feel a connection, even a strong one, and still walk away if it's harming their emotional health. That ability to detach while still caring is what elevates them. It's what keeps them from clinging to potential and instead grounds them in reality. They stop overanalyzing text messages, stop replaying conversations, and stop waiting for the avoidant to change. They begin to sit with their own discomfort instead of outsourcing it to someone who doesn't have the capacity to meet them where they are. They begin to understand the difference between emotional availability and emotional chemistry. Just because someone makes you feel butterflies doesn't mean they are healthy for you. The super empath learns to differentiate between intensity and intimacy. With that awareness, they start to set new standards. They become more selective. They notice early signs of emotional avoidance. The fear of labeling the relationship, the avoidance of vulnerable conversations, the tendency to keep things casual despite emotional closeness. And when they spot those patterns, they don't wait around hoping things will improve. They address them directly, and if nothing changes, they walk. They've learned that real love doesn't require endless emotional labor. Most importantly, they stop abandoning themselves. They stop shrinking, quieting, or molding their needs to fit someone else's limitations. They know that detaching doesn't mean they've stopped loving. It means they've started loving smarter. They can still care deeply, but from a place of wisdom. Their boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They are gates to protect the kind of love they know they deserve. The super empath has trained themselves to recognize when emotional unavailability is being disguised as complexity, and they no longer take the bait. So when the avoidant disappears, the super empath doesn't chase. They observe. They protect their peace. They trust their intuition. And with every step rooted in awareness, they move closer to relationships that offer safety, reciprocity, and true connection. The moment a super empath sets a boundary, something profound happens, not just in the dynamic with the avoidant, but within themselves. Boundaries become their superpower, not because they push people away, but because they communicate self-worth in action. For someone used to over-accommodating, saying no, or "this doesn't work for me," can feel like rebellion. But over time, the super empath learns that boundaries are not acts of aggression. They're acts of self-preservation and clarity. They're not used to control others, but to protect one's emotional environment. Avoidants, by nature, are drawn to people who overextend themselves. The more someone gives without question, the more space the avoidant feels entitled to take. The less they show up, the more they expect understanding. But when the super empath starts asserting boundaries, like needing consistent communication, emotional presence, or clarity in intentions, the dynamic shifts immediately. The avoidant can no longer float in and out of connection unchallenged. The room they used to have to disappear and return as they pleased begins to shrink, and with it, their control. What's interesting is that boundaries don't necessarily push the avoidant away right away. In fact, they often spark intrigue. For someone who is used to people bending over backward to keep them close, encountering someone who says, "I won't stay if this continues," introduces a level of respect they're not used to. The avoidant may not like it, but they notice it. And more importantly, they feel it. Boundaries say what words sometimes can't. "I value myself enough to walk away if this isn't healthy for me." The super empath isn't throwing ultimatums, they're simply being honest. They're not threatening to leave for the sake of drama, they're showing up with their needs calmly and clearly. They're not demanding perfection, but they are asking for effort. That clarity disrupts the usual dance. The avoidant may try to test it, they may pull back, hoping the old patterns return. But when the super empath stays grounded and doesn't fold, it creates a new kind of energy, one built on mutual respect rather than emotional survival. And here's the beauty of it, the boundary itself becomes attractive, not in a manipulative way, but in a deeply authentic one. When someone can communicate their needs and walk away from what doesn't honor them, it signals emotional strength. It signals that they are not desperate for connection. They are selective. The avoidant, who is often used to partners adapting around their fears, now sees someone who won't. That resistance challenges their narrative that love must always mean suffocation or loss of control. But the super empath isn't setting boundaries to win anyone over. They're doing it because they've learned through experience that love without boundaries is chaos. They've been drained before. They've overgiven before. They know what it feels like to be emotionally exhausted by inconsistency. So now, when someone disappears for days and returns like nothing happened, the response isn't warmth, it's distance. When someone deflects vulnerability with sarcasm or distraction, they call it out. When intentions are vague, they ask for clarity. And when that clarity doesn't come, they don't beg for it. They leave. This new way of relating doesn't come from ego. It comes from having finally learned what respect looks like in practice. It's not just about being nice or understanding. It's about requiring mutual investment. The super empath doesn't see boundaries as walls, but as filters. They separate those who are emotionally capable from those who just enjoy emotional access. By setting these boundaries, they protect not only their time, but their peace, their energy, and their capacity to love in a healthy, sustainable way. What once felt like loss now feels like alignment. What once felt like fear now feels like freedom. And all of it began with one simple shift, understanding that boundaries are not barriers to connection. They are the gateway to real intimacy. Real power doesn't come from trying to control another person's behavior. It comes from being deeply rooted in your own self-worth. The super empath used to believe that if they could just say the right thing, be more patient or love harder, they could get the avoidant to open up. But eventually, they learn that true emotional strength isn't found in constant effort to fix or prove. It's found in standing firm in your values and letting go of what isn't aligned. That's when everything changes. Instead of trying to control the outcome, the super empath begins to focus on what they can control: their own actions, choices, and emotional health. When you're dealing with someone avoidant, the temptation to over-function is strong. The emotional push-pull dynamic creates anxiety, and that anxiety leads to overreaching. The avoidant becomes distant, and the empath responds by leaning in harder, initiating conversations, reassuring them, trying to make things feel safe. But safety is not something one person can create alone. And the super empath begins to understand that if safety is always one-sided, it's not safety at all. It's imbalance. This realization frees them from the exhausting cycle of emotional labor. They no longer take on the responsibility of keeping the relationship alive single-handedly. Instead, they step back and allow the other person to reveal their capacity for connection. This isn't about punishing someone with silence or withdrawal. It's about making room to see the truth. When the avoidant doesn't step forward in the space created, the super empath takes note. They don't get caught up in trying to force what isn't mutual. They let the silence speak for itself. Power, in this new context, isn't reactive, it's responsive. It doesn't come from grand gestures or dramatic exits. It comes from a quiet, confident awareness of what is and isn't acceptable. It comes from choosing not to engage in emotional chaos and instead choosing peace, even if that means walking away. The super empath doesn't need to argue or convince. They've realized that not everyone is meant to stay, and letting someone go doesn't mean failure. It means growth. That growth shows up in how they carry themselves. They no longer apologize for having needs. They no longer tiptoe around someone else's discomfort. If someone avoids intimacy, they don't try to soften themselves to make them feel safer. They understand that emotional closeness requires emotional courage, and if the other person isn't willing to meet them in that space, there's no point dragging them there. It's not about changing for love. It's about finding love that doesn't ask you to change your essence. Their power also shows in their emotional regulation. Instead of spiraling when the avoidant pulls away, they self-soothe. Instead of reacting impulsively, they reflect, they know their triggers, and they don't blame others for them. This level of emotional responsibility means they don't project old wounds onto new situations. They show up with clarity and expect the same in return. And when they don't get it, they adjust their position not to punish, but to protect. By staying grounded in their own values, the super empath naturally begins to attract people who are capable of giving what they've always given. They stop being drawn to the mystery of someone who can't show up consistently. They're no longer addicted to potential. They want real, reciprocal love, and they don't settle for less. If someone can't meet them with the same level of intentionality, they don't argue or plead. They simply step back, not out of defeat, but out of deep self-respect. That's the true shift from needing to be chosen to doing the choosing, from performing to feel loved to simply being, and trusting that the right person will meet them there. This kind of power doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply says, this is who I am. This is what I need. And I'm not afraid to walk away if that can't be honored. Outgrowing someone is one of the most powerful experiences a person can have, especially when that someone once had such a strong emotional grip on you. The super empath, who may have once felt powerless in the presence of an avoidant, doesn't just outsmart them. They evolve beyond the entire dynamic. What used to feel magnetic now feels draining. What once sparked obsession now triggers indifference. That shift is not just intellectual, it's emotional and embodied. It doesn't happen because they've become numb or jaded. It happens because they've leveled up emotionally. They no longer seek validation in places where it's never consistently offered. They no longer fall for half love disguised as deep connection. The avoidant often reappears when they sense that they're losing their grip, and it's during this moment that the transformation becomes crystal clear. Where the super empath once would have welcomed them back with hope and longing, they now see the pattern with new eyes. They recognize the cycle of distance, return, confusion, and disappointment. But this time, they don't fall for it. Not because they've stopped caring altogether, but because they've started caring more about themselves than the fantasy they once held on to. Avoidants often thrive on ambiguity. It keeps them in control. But clarity, which the super empath now lies by, is the one thing they can't manipulate. When the super empath begins to require directness, emotional accountability, and reciprocity, the avoidant starts to feel exposed. They're no longer dealing with someone who can be pulled into their emotional roller coaster. They're dealing with someone who has their feet firmly on the ground, someone who sees through excuses, someone who has no interest in emotional crumbs when they know they can have the whole meal. The super empath doesn't need closure because they've already given it to themselves. They don't need apologies or explanations to move on. They've already dissected the relationship, grieved it, learned from it, and built something stronger in its place themselves. When the avoidant comes back around, hinting at reconnection or nostalgia, the reaction isn't desperation or eagerness. It's discernment. The super empath asks, what has actually changed here? And if the answer is nothing, they keep moving forward, not out of bitterness, but out of integrity. This kind of growth often goes unnoticed by others, but it's felt deeply by the one who experiences it. The super empath no longer finds chaos romantic. They don't mistake emotional intensity for intimacy. They've become fluent in their own needs and non-negotiables. That fluency gives them emotional independence, the ability to stay open, hearted without clinging, to love deeply without losing themselves. They stop needing to win someone over. They stop needing to be seen by people who refuse to look. And as they grow into this version of themselves, their entire energy changes. They attract differently. They connect differently. They no longer chase chemistry alone. They look for compatibility, alignment, and mutual effort. They no longer feel the urge to rescue or fix. When they see emotional unavailability now, they don't try to crack the code. They simply acknowledge it and walk away. They don't waste time arguing with potential. They honor what's real and let go of what's not. The most powerful thing about outgrowing someone is that they no longer have emotional access to you in the same way. The avoidant may still reach out, test the waters, send a breadcrumb, but the super empath doesn't bite. Not because they don't care, but because they've evolved past the version of themselves that needed someone to choose them in order to feel whole. They already feel whole. And that's what truly ends the cycle, not revenge, not silence, but evolution. It's in the quiet, confident decision to rise above the dynamic that once held them hostage. And once that growth has taken place, there's no going back. Let's bring this all together. The super empath's journey is not just about dealing with avoidance. It's about reclaiming power, peace, and clarity in the face of confusion. It's about stepping out of emotional loops where you once over-functioned, over-explained, and over-extended yourself for someone who couldn't or wouldn't meet you in the middle. It's about recognizing the difference between chemistry and compatibility, between temporary attention and lasting effort. You don't win by changing the avoidant. You win by no longer needing to. You win by realizing that your love doesn't need to be proven through pain, tested through neglect, or earned through endurance. You win by walking away from what confuses you and choosing what aligns with you. That's the quiet, grounded power of the super empath. When you know your worth, you stop waiting to be chosen. You choose. You don't cling to potential. You honor reality. You don't beg for clarity. You become it. And from that space, you attract not only a different kind of connection, but a completely different level of peace. So, to every super empath listening, your ability to feel deeply is not your weakness. It's your superpower. Just make sure it's matched with wisdom, boundaries, and self-respect. Because when it is, nothing, not even the most avoidant person, can shake your foundation. Thank you for giving me your time, your attention, and your heart today. Wherever you are on your journey, know this: you are not too much. You are not too emotional. You are simply someone who refuses to settle for halfway love, and that is your strength. Take care of your heart. Keep choosing you. And as always, thank you for listening. Goodbye.